There are stories that shake us, that force us to confront the darkest corners of human nature. The story of Larry Hoover is one of those tales, a narrative of choices that destroyed thousands of lives, of ambition twisted into violence, of power built on the suffering of entire communities. This isn't just a story about one man. It's about the consequences of decisions, the ripple effects of crime, and the countless victims left in the wake of an empire built on drugs, murder, and terror. Before we dive deep into this journey, I want to connect with you. Where are you watching from right now? Are you in Chicago, where this story unfolded? Maybe you're from another city that felt the reach of these crimes. Drop your location in the comments below, and please, hit that like button. This story needs to be told, and your engagement helps spread awareness about the real cost of gang violence. Larry Hoover Sr. was born on November 30th, 1950 in Jackson, Mississippi. His family, like so many African-American families of that era, fled the brutal segregation of the South when he was just 4 years old, seeking a better life in Chicago, Illinois. They settled in Englewood, a neighborhood on the South Side that would become synonymous with violence and despair. But let's be clear from the start, poverty doesn't create criminals. Difficult circumstances don't force anyone to murder. Hoover made choices, deliberate, calculated choices that would leave a trail of blood across America. By the time he was 12 years old, Hoover had already begun making those choices. Small thefts, robberies, crimes that might seem minor, but were the first steps down a path of destruction. At 13, he dropped out of elementary school and joined the Supreme Gangsters, a street gang composed primarily of young African-American men. What started as fights and petty theft quickly escalated into shootings and assaults. Each choice led to another. Each act of violence made the next one easier. The true birth of the criminal enterprise that would terrorize Chicago for decades came in the late 1960s. In 1966, Hoover founded the Supreme Gangsters, but his ambitions were already growing beyond a simple street gang. The landscape of Chicago's gang world was fragmented, with numerous small groups fighting over territory, creating chaos and bloodshed. Hoover saw an opportunity, not to reduce violence, as some would later claim, but to consolidate power. In June of 1969, a merger changed everything. Hoover and David Barksdale, leader of the Black Disciples, united their gangs to form the Black Gangster Disciple Nation, later known simply as the Gangster Disciples or GDs. The rhetoric surrounding this merger spoke of stability and reducing bloodshed, of aligning with broader alliances like the Lords, Stones, and Disciples Coalition. They claimed to be about civil rights and violence reduction. But rhetoric and reality are two very different things. The truth was far darker. This wasn't about peace. It was about power, control, and the ability to dominate the drug trade more effectively. When Barksdale died in 1974 from complications of an assassination attempt 4 years earlier, Hoover seized complete control. He declared himself king, or chairman, and under his leadership, the Gangster Disciples transformed from a street gang into a criminal empire. In 1978, while already imprisoned, a detail we'll return to shortly, Hoover created the Folk Nation, a massive alliance of gangs that included the Gangster Disciples, Maniac Latin Disciples, Spanish Gangsters, and others. This expansion pushed the organization's influence westward across Chicago and throughout the Midwest. The GDs found themselves in brutal competition with the People Nation, which included gangs like the Latin Kings and Vice Lords, sparking territorial wars that would claim hundreds of lives. The structure Hoover built was methodically hierarchical and chillingly efficient. At the top sat Hoover himself, the undisputed chairman. Below him were regional governors who controlled entire cities or states. These governors commanded local regents who managed neighborhoods and territories. At the bottom were the soldiers, the young men who did the actual work of selling drugs, committing violence, and dying in the streets. The organization adopted powerful symbols: a six-pointed star representing love, life, loyalty, knowledge, wisdom, and understanding, concepts weaponized to serve criminal ends. They used the number 74, with 6 plus 4 equaling 10, supposedly symbolizing unity. In reality, these symbols marked territory and identified enemies. Under Hoover's command, the Gangster Disciples came to dominate the south side of Chicago. They controlled the drug trade, cocaine and heroin with an iron fist. They extorted local businesses, forcing shop owners to pay for protection or face violence. By the 1970s, the gang had grown to more than 1,000 members, using their drug profits to buy weapons and expand their territories through intimidation and murder. Then came the 1980s and the crack cocaine epidemic. This was when the Gangster Disciples transformed from a major local gang into a national criminal powerhouse. The profits were staggering, initially around $1,000 per day in the early days, but soon escalating to millions annually. The organization expanded its operations to cities across America: Detroit, Memphis, Birmingham, and dozens of others. Young men joined, not out of necessity, but out of the allure of fast money and power, seduced by the lifestyle that Hoover's propaganda machine promoted. Hoover implemented policies that gave his organization a veneer of sophistication. He accepted members of multiple races, breaking from the strictly racial composition of earlier gangs. He prohibited attacks on prison guards, understanding that maintaining some boundaries would allow him to continue operating from behind bars. But make no mistake, these policies weren't about enlightenment or progress. They were tactical decisions designed to strengthen the organization and reduce unwanted law enforcement attention. The human cost was catastrophic. The Gangster Disciples were responsible for hundreds of murders, perhaps thousands when you count the deaths from drug overdoses, the victims of territorial disputes, the innocent bystanders caught in crossfire. In Englewood, the neighborhood where Hoover grew up, mothers buried their sons, children grew up without fathers, communities lived in constant fear. Every dollar the GDs made came at the cost of destroyed lives and broken families. In 1989, internal disputes led to a split, with some factions breaking away to form a separate Black Disciples organization. The disagreements centered on drug territory in Englewood, the very neighborhood Hoover had once called home. Even from prison, Hoover maintained remote control of his empire, using visits and smuggled communications to dictate orders. The violence continued unabated. Then came 1993, and one of the most cynical rebranding efforts in criminal history. Hoover attempted to transform the Gangster Disciples' image by renaming them Growth and Development. Suddenly, the organization was supposedly about education, non-violence, and community activism. They established non-profits, created a record label, organized protests. Hoover positioned himself as a reformer, a leader who had seen the error of his ways and now wanted to uplift the community. Law enforcement saw through this facade immediately. Federal wiretaps revealed the truth. While Hoover preached peace and development in public, he was privately coordinating interstate drug trafficking, ordering violence against rivals, and continuing to build his criminal empire. The growth and development movement was nothing more than a sophisticated public relations campaign designed to reduce scrutiny and generate sympathy. It was manipulation on a massive scale, using the language of civil rights and community empowerment to disguise continued criminality. But even the most careful criminal eventually faces justice. For Hoover, the reckoning began in 1973, though he'd evade full accountability for another 2 decades. In February of that year, Hoover ordered the murder of William Pookie Young, a rival drug dealer accused of stealing from the gang. This wasn't a heat-of-the-moment decision. It was a calculated execution ordered by Hoover to send a message. Young was shot to death, another life snuffed out in service of Hoover's ambitions. Hoover was arrested in September 1973 following a traffic chase. By December, he had been convicted of murder and sentenced to 150 to 200 years in prison. He began serving his time at Stateville Correctional Center. Most people would consider this the end of the story, a murderer behind bars, justice served. But for Hoover, prison was merely a change of venue. From his cell at Stateville, Hoover continued to run the Gangster Disciples with ruthless efficiency. He used prison visits, smuggled communications, and a network of loyal lieutenants to maintain control. The violence continued. The drug dealing continued. Young men continued to die. The organization grew larger and more sophisticated, eventually reaching an estimated 30,000 members across 35 states by the 1990s. All of this happened while Hoover sat in a prison cell, proof that incarceration alone wasn't enough to stop him. Federal law enforcement agencies, the FBI, ATF, and DEA, launched a massive investigation into Hoover and the Gangster Disciples. This investigation would span 17 years, involving hundreds of agents, thousands of hours of surveillance, and meticulous evidence gathering. In 1995, the hammer finally fell. Hoover was indicted on 40 federal crimes, including conspiracy, extortion, money laundering, and continuing criminal enterprise. Prosecutors presented evidence that the GDs were generating $100 million annually under his leadership, with 30,000 members committing crimes across the nation. In 1997, justice arrived in its fullest form. Hoover was convicted and sentenced to 6 consecutive life sentences in federal prison. He was transferred to ADX Florence in Colorado, America's most secure supermax prison, where he was placed in solitary confinement. This was the end of the road, or so everyone thought. Welcome back. If you're just joining us, we're in the middle of exploring one of the most devastating criminal stories in American history. Before we continue, I need you to do something. Hit that like button right now. And tell me, where are you watching from? Are you from the Midwest? The South? Have you been affected by gang violence in your community? Your stories matter, and sharing this video helps others understand the real consequences of these crimes. ADX Florence, where Hoover was sent in 1997, isn't just any prison. It's known as the Alcatraz of the Rockies, designed to hold America's most dangerous criminals in near-total isolation. 23 hours a day in a concrete cell. 1 hour of solitary exercise in a concrete yard. No contact with other inmates, no phone calls, extremely limited visitation. For most people, this would be the ultimate punishment, the absolute end of any ability to influence the outside world. Hoover spent years in these conditions. While some might view this as cruel, consider what he built. An organization responsible for countless murders, thousands of destroyed families, communities torn apart by drug addiction and violence. The isolation wasn't arbitrary cruelty. It was the only way to prevent him from continuing to command his criminal empire. Even from regular prison, he'd proven he could coordinate drug trafficking and violence. ADX Florence was designed specifically to stop people like him. But something unexpected happened in the decades that followed. Larry Hoover became a cause célèbre, a symbol embraced by celebrities and activists who argued for his release. The most prominent voice in this campaign was the rapper Kanye West, who later changed his name to Ye. For more than a decade, Ye championed Hoover's case, mentioning him in concerts, incorporating pleas for his release into songs, and organizing petition campaigns. Other celebrities joined the chorus: Chance the Rapper, Reverend Jesse Jackson, Reverend Al Sharpton, and former Congressman Bobby Rush all lent their support. The argument these supporters made was multifaceted. They pointed to Hoover's age. He's now 75 years old. They emphasized his time served, over 4 decades behind bars. They claimed he'd renounced violence and the gang lifestyle. They argued that the conditions of his confinement were inhumane. Some even suggested that his growth and development movement had been genuine, that he'd truly tried to transform from within. Let's be absolutely clear about something. Sympathy for a person's current circumstances doesn't erase their past actions. Age doesn't erase the murders Hoover ordered. Decades in prison don't bring back the victims. Renouncing violence after building an empire on bloodshed doesn't undo the trauma inflicted on entire communities. The celebrity support Hoover received speaks to a troubling tendency in our culture to romanticize criminal figures, to separate the person from their crimes, to focus on redemption without fully grappling with accountability. In May of 2025, something remarkable happened that shocked many observers. President Donald Trump commuted Hoover's federal sentences. Trump, who had run on a law and order platform, who had consistently taken hardline positions on crime, granted clemency to one of America's most notorious gang leaders. The decision came after years of lobbying by Ye and other celebrities who had Trump's ear. The commutation was controversial from the moment it was announced. On social media platforms like X, formerly known as Twitter, people expressed outrage and confusion. How could an administration that promised to crack down on crime, particularly gang crime, in cities like Memphis, where the Gangster Disciples remain active, simultaneously release one of the most infamous gang leaders in American history? Critics called it hypocrisy. Some suggested it was purely transactional, a favor to celebrity supporters. Others saw it as evidence that justice in America operates on two tiers, one for the well-connected, another for everyone else. But here's a crucial detail that got lost in much of the media coverage. The commutation only applied to Hoover's federal sentences. He remains incarcerated in the Colorado State Penitentiary, still serving his state sentence of up to 200 years for the 1973 murder of William Pookie Young. The presidential commutation, while symbolically significant, didn't actually free him. This brings us to the present moment. In October of 2025, Hoover's attorneys filed a petition for clemency with Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker. The petition argues several points: that Hoover has served over 50 years in prison, that he's now 75 years old with serious health problems, including 3 recent heart attacks, that the conditions of his confinement have been extreme, and that he poses minimal risk of reoffending given his age and physical condition. The petition describes Hoover being forced to work in the prison kitchen despite his cardiac issues. It paints a picture of an elderly man suffering under harsh conditions. His supporters argue that keeping him imprisoned serves no purpose, that he's paid his debt to society and should be allowed to return to Chicago to work on violence interruption programs in the community he once terrorized. The petition has been sent to the Illinois Prisoner Review Board, which will make a recommendation to Governor Pritzker. A parole hearing is scheduled for late 2025. There are precedents for releasing elderly inmates who were convicted before 1978, and Hoover's legal team is hoping to benefit from these precedents. Let's pause here and consider what's being asked. Hoover's supporters want him released to work on violence interruption in Chicago. This raises profound questions. Can the architect of violence become a peacemaker? Should communities that suffered under his organization's reign of terror welcome him back as a reformer? Is genuine redemption possible for someone responsible for so much death and destruction? There's something deeply troubling about the narrative of redemption being constructed around Hoover. In 2022, he publicly renounced the Gangster Disciples. But this renunciation came after more than 50 years, after thousands of lives were destroyed, after he'd built an empire that continues to operate and commit violence to this day. The Gangster Disciples didn't disappear when Hoover was locked away. They remain active in Chicago, Memphis, and cities across America, still trafficking drugs, still committing murders, still recruiting young people into a lifestyle that leads to prison or death. Hoover married Wendy Jenkins Hoover in 2020 while incarcerated. He has 3 children. His supporters emphasize his family connections as evidence of his humanity, his capacity for love and change. But what about the families of his victims? What about William Pookie Young's family, who lost their loved one to a murder Hoover ordered? What about the thousands of families torn apart by the organization he built? The celebrity support for Hoover's release reflects a broader cultural problem. We've become fascinated by criminal figures, turning them into folk heroes and symbols. We write books about them, make documentaries, create art celebrating their complexity. Artists like Yeah and Killer Mike have referenced Hoover in their work, treating him as a symbol of systemic injustice rather than as a person who made deliberate choices to harm others. Yes, Hoover grew up in poverty. Yes, he faced racism. Yes, the South Side of Chicago in the 1950s and 60s offered limited opportunities for young African-American men. But thousands of people grew up in those same circumstances and didn't build criminal empires. They didn't order murders. They didn't flood their communities with drugs. They made different choices, harder choices often, than the path Hoover took. This is where we must be careful and honest. Acknowledging systemic problems doesn't mean excusing individual responsibility. Poverty and racism are real and devastating forces that shape people's options and opportunities. But they don't eliminate choice. They don't make murder inevitable. Hoover had agency, and he used that agency to create an organization that destroyed countless lives. The conditions at ADX Florence may indeed be harsh. Solitary confinement for decades takes a psychological toll. But these conditions exist because of Hoover's demonstrated ability to command criminal operations from behind bars. When he was in regular prison at Stateville, he ran the Gangster Disciples, coordinating drug deals and violence. The extreme security measures weren't arbitrary. They were necessary responses to his continued criminality. Now, at 75, with failing health, Hoover presents differently than he did at 30 or 40. Age and infirmity have diminished his physical capacity, but we must ask, does physical weakness equal moral transformation? Does the inability to personally commit violence mean the will to do so has disappeared? These are questions without easy answers. Hoover wrote a book in 1996 called The Blueprint of a New Concept, promoting personal transformation and redemption. Some supporters point to this as evidence of his change. But writing about redemption isn't the same as actually redeeming oneself. Words on a page don't undo decades of harm. They don't bring back the dead. They don't heal traumatized communities. The debate over Hoover's release ultimately forces us to confront fundamental questions about justice, punishment, and redemption. What is the purpose of imprisonment? Is it purely punitive, making someone suffer for their crimes? Is it protective, keeping dangerous people away from society? Is it rehabilitative, changing people so they can safely return to society? Or is it some combination of all three? Reasonable people can disagree about whether a 75-year-old man with heart problems who's been imprisoned for over 50 years should remain behind bars. But what we cannot do is forget the reality of what Hoover did. We cannot romanticize him. We cannot turn him into a symbol of systemic injustice while ignoring that he was an architect of injustice himself, inflicting suffering on the very communities he now claims to want to help. The Gangster Disciples' legacy is written in blood across American cities. It's written in the lives of young men who joined seeking belonging and ended up dead or imprisoned. It's written in the addiction and broken families left behind by the drug trade. It's written in the trauma that still haunts neighborhoods like Inglewood, where residents remember when the streets were war zones. Larry Hoover's story isn't a redemption tale. It's a cautionary tale about choices and consequences. It's about how one person's decisions can ripple outward, destroying thousands of lives. It's about the seductive nature of power and the human capacity for rationalization. Hoover convinced himself and tried to convince others that he was building something positive, that growth and development was real. But the foundation was always blood and suffering. As we approach the end of 2025, Hoover's fate lies in the hands of Governor Pritzker and the Illinois Prisoner Review Board. Whatever they decide, we must remember the full truth of this story. We must honor the victims, not just William Young, whose murder put Hoover behind bars, but the countless others whose lives were destroyed by the organization he built. If you've made it this far, thank you for taking this journey with me. This story matters because it's still unfolding in cities across America. The Gangster Disciples still exist. Young people are still being recruited into gangs. Families are still being torn apart. Understanding how we got here, how one person's choices in the 1960s led to a criminal empire that persists today, is essential if we want to break these cycles. Hit that like button if this story impacted you. Share this video with someone who needs to understand the real cost of gang violence. And tell me in the comments, what do you think about the calls for Hoover's release? Where do you stand on questions of redemption versus accountability? Remember, every choice matters. Every decision has consequences that ripple far beyond what we can see in the moment. Larry Hoover's choices destroyed communities. The question now is whether those communities will ever truly heal, and whether the man responsible should walk free. Thank you for watching. Stay safe out there, and remember, we all have the power to choose differently.